In this final study, we are going to be looking at the time factor as it affects the way we personally need to be developing. Basic Christianity has concerned itself with our relationship to God and to other people and how we develop in the interaction that goes on between God above and those who are around us. Now we want to look at that personal development that takes place over time, because that is one of the primary dimensions of our lives. And the Scripture itself has recognized this, you might say, by the kinds of literature that is provided for us. In regard to the present, there is what we call wisdom literature. And some of the books in the Old Testament, like the book of Ecclesiastes or Proverbs or Psalms, or the Song of Solomon, would be examples of wisdom literature. In the New Testament, we have the book of James, the book of Jude, maybe the Sermon on the Mount, that tell us how to go about life more or less in the present, gives us commandments and gives us advice. In recognizing then the past, the Scripture fills us in with history, and we have several books in the Old and New Testament that tell us what has happened in the past. But beyond those two dimensions is the third that we call the future. And Scripture as well takes that into account as an important aspect of our lives by giving us prophecy. And we have quite a lot of that in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel and Ezekiel and other books. And in the New Testament, we have Revelation as well as snatches and pieces within the other books that tell us something about what God is going to do in the future so that we can line ourselves up correctly with it. So in talking about our personal development, it's important for us to remember the time factor and how that has an impact upon our daily lives. Now, the first thing that we want to talk about in that connection is what we might call the two dimensions of life. We talk about present, past, and future, but really the past and the future are kind of in a line together. And so we can conceive of them as one overall pattern that we follow through on. The other, the present, forms a second thing in comparison with it. And so the two dimensions of life are a kind of a sideways interaction with those who are around us and with the events that are going on around us. And then the other dimension is the forward thrust that goes on until Christ comes again and takes us to himself. One way of looking at this combination of sideways and forward movement in life is to remember maybe one of our classes when we went to school years ago. There was a course called geography, or at least a subject that we studied. And in geography, we studied where lands were and what different countries looked like and how the topography of their country was and what they produced and all those sorts of things. If we take this map of the world and lay it out in front of ourselves, we can see that there are lines that go around in one direction and then lines that go around vertical and perpendicular to that. As we head east to west, we have what we call longitude on this map. And that is kind of like the forward thrust through time. The other dimension is north and south, and that's called latitude. And that can serve as a kind of a picture of our relationship to other people around us and the environment in which we find ourselves. So even as a map contains latitude and longitude, so also the map of our lives is a little bit like that. There is that forward thrust, and then there is the sideways interaction with those people and events that are going on around us. Now, we want to notice a couple things, first of all, about the latitude part. That when we carry on our lives, we are in interaction between ourselves and our environment. And we have another diagram here to kind of capture this relationship that we have with those about us and the events that are going on. Now, there are a couple things that are important that we want to emphasize about this before we go on to our main theme for this study. And that is that when we're dealing with the interactions between ourselves and our environment, we are wrapped up in the matter of meaning. And we are concerned with the significance and the value of our actions. We're thinking about the satisfaction that we are receiving from the life that we are living. There are some sayings that we would like to use in connection with this. And one of the sayings is that the meaning of an event is in the event. Now, if we were to use a wedding ceremony as an example, perhaps we could see something of the point we're trying to make here. As we experience something, the meaning and value that we experience is in the event. When two people come before the Lord in marriage, they stand also before society and say, in effect to society, I accept this person as my spouse. There is a meaning in that event. But there's a second dimension to that. And we have a saying that says that the meaning of an event is seen in the event. Not only is there kind of the objective worth and value of things, but there is what we also read into it. And if you remember the time of your own wedding, or maybe you're anticipating one, you can think that when you came to that particular event in life and made those choices that led up to that event, you had certain aspirations and values and hopes that went into that event. Consequently, you sort of meant into it things that were even above and beyond what we normally understand to be part of the event we call a marriage. And so, as we go back and forth in relationship to those who are around us, we can use maybe the marriage thing as an example of the meanings that go on as we interact with those events and with other people around us. The meaning is in the event. We also bring meaning into it. Now, when we look forward to the ongoing thrust of history and our own lives in it, then we can add this other dimension and talk about the interaction between ourselves and our future. The diagram that we had with the arrows going back and forth between ourselves and those around us now can have another line added to it that thrusts us out into the future. It is important for us to realize that the future of an event belongs to the event. That's another one of our sayings. And the importance of that observation is that our days and our acts and our choices are not just things that happen all by themselves with no consideration for what has gone on before and no consideration for what happens into the future. Paul had this idea in mind, I believe, in Galatians 6, when he talked about the law of harvest, that you sow, you reap what you sow. And God is not mocked, because if we sow one way, there are certain kind of results that grow out of it. If we sow another way, there are other kinds of consequences that come from that. So the importance that we want to observe right here is that the events and choices and actions, deeds of our lives are not separate from the total flow of life. They tie into those things that grow out of them. And so we need to live with an awareness of what is going to be coming out of the choices that we are making today. Some people do not always do that very well. I had a friend that I grew up with out in the country. He just seemed to go do things with no consideration for, at all of what was going to happen as a result of it. He just sort of like brought a wall down in front of his face without thinking of what was going to lie beyond that when he said this or when he did this. It is as if the future was not going to happen for him. He just went on and did what he wanted to. Now, when you do that, you mess up life. And so the important thing for us to remember here is that when the future of an event belongs to the event, that means that in the event, in the choice, in the deed, we need to think that this is going to lead to other considerations afterwards, and we need to make our choices in light of that fact. A fourth saying that we want to bring up is that the meaning of an event becomes in the future of that event. Now, the significance of that is to say that we do not always understand fully the implications of the choices we make at the time we make them. And if we go back to our marriage illustration again, there was a meaning that happened at the time, there was a meaning that we read into it, but there is also the future that grows out of that choice to marry the spouse that we've chosen. As time goes along, the choice of who we married grows, you might say, because there are implications that arise out of that choice, and then out of that are others that grow. And really, if we had never made this directional choice, this direction-setting choice back here, then many of these things that have happened down the road would not have happened. And so we need to anticipate the fact that when we make a choice, we do not see all the meaning of it, because the meaning of that choice will grow over time inasmuch as it leads on to other things. And so when we want to live a completely fulfilled life, we want to think about the fulfillment of our actions on down the road. Consequently, the ones we marry, the deeds that we do, the words that we say, will lead on to other things, and we need to remember that when we go about our lives. This leads us to another emphasis now on the interaction between the present and the future. We've been talking so far about the fact that we are in relationship to others and our environment around us, and we need to be tuned in and aware of what's going on, and that's fine. And we've also talked about this forward thrust to life, and that there is a kind of a continuum there. The events are tied into the things that follow after them. Now we want to emphasize the fact that there is an interaction between the future and the present in which we find ourselves. Now, when we first of all look at how the present grows toward the future, we want to emphasize this one idea, that history is not just what we call eventuation. When we use the word eventuation, what we mean is that one thing just leads to another, and then that leads to another thing, and there is no particular direction to it all. It's just the feel that one thing is connected with the next, and you just kind of go around in a lack of direction in your life. The Scripture teaches us that the whole of history is not like that. The whole of history is not just a matter of the bouncing around of one cause on a following effect, and that effect on the following one, and all of that. It teaches us instead that God has predestined where He wants history to go as a whole. And we've prepared another diagram here to kind of catch a picture of this. A wide arrow is kind of a representation of what history is like. And I, as an individual, represented by this X in it, can move around left to right, and we have quite a bit of freedom. But we have to be going in the general direction that history is going, because we are caught up in God's predestined future. Now, predestination is one of the hard doctrines of Scripture, but our only concern with it right here is to say that history has a direction to it because God up front predestined where its destiny was going to come out. So we do not want to live life as if it's just a matter of bouncing around from one thing to whatever happens to come up next. But we have to organize our individual lives so that they fit in with the overall flow of history in which our life takes place. Now, there's another thing that we want to emphasize about the present that grows toward the future, and that is that the future is not produced just from what occurs inside of history. Let me try to explain that a little bit. What is going to happen in the future, we are not limited to the resources of human beings and others who are down here inside of this flow of history. Instead, we recognize that God can come into our history and to provide something beyond what we ourselves could produce in it. And so in this way, Christianity is taking responsibility for the present and for the future, but we need to remember that we are not the only ones responsible for the future. We have to be responsible for our contribution to it, but we do not want to forget that God breaks into history and adds and brings about the consequences that He would like to have occur. In fact, you might look at the Bible as a kind of a record of the special acts of God as He has broken into the flow of human history and has added His direction-setting acts on top of what we as human beings do. And so we have a greater hope because the future is not just up to us, even though we have an important contribution to make there, but it is also impacted by God as He comes into it and shapes it the way He would want to do it. The second thing we want to say about the interaction between the present and the future is that the future shapes the present. Now, this is true particularly if we keep in mind that our actions lead to other results that flow from them. Because what happens then is that we have the present causing the future, but back here in the present, we stop and think about what kind of future our actions are going to produce. So you might say the future comes back up on us and affects the way we think and how we choose. At least that's the way it ought to be. So we penetrate the future mentally and think twice about our actions. And as a consequence, it's going to affect the way we develop and how we carry on our lives before God. This will move us now on to the central point of things that we want to emphasize in our study here, and that is that there is a power that the future has when we take into consideration the fact that it is going to arise out of our actions and take into consideration that God is going to impact that as well. We live toward the future, so we consciously plan what we're doing. The biggest thing that we can say to each other in this matter of living life before God is that we want to get out of the habit of just sort of living it unconsciously without much of an awareness of what's going on. We just do what comes naturally, and we just respond to whatever stimuli there are in our environment. Instead of all of that, we need to take hold of life and take charge of it and do that in terms of the future that is growing out of it. There are 4 statements that we want to make in this connection about the power of the future upon the present. The one is that the future increases satisfaction by organizing life. Now, there's a particular way in which this is true. When you plan, when you have a goal, when you have a direction that you're going, then your actions are done in terms of that. And since you don't have enough time and resources and money to do everything, then you have to select among the various possibilities as to what you are in fact going to do. If you have in mind the future that is on out ahead of you, then that will serve as a basis for selectivity of your actions in the present. And you'll not get caught up in a lot of other things, even if they are good, because you are concerned to direct your life toward the goal that you have chosen with God's help. On top of the fact that there is a selection process there is also greater energy expended by us. You can really tell the difference between a person who has some place consciously that he's trying to go in his life as distinguished from someone who kind of goes through a routine of getting up in the morning and going to bed at night and getting up in the morning and going to bed at night again. There's a lack of diligence in this latter kind of case that is present in a person's life who has taken charge of it. He's going somewhere. He has some things he wants to do. He expends his energy and throws himself more fully into it. Consequently, as a result of that, there's a greater efficiency in his life. He accomplishes more per time. He gets more done per energy and per the other resources that he has to put in all that. When we work purposefully, in other words, we work harder and we get more done. Now, that means that there is greater satisfaction that comes to our lives. There is a satisfaction in the very process of interacting with other people. In the very experiences of life themselves, we get a certain amount of enjoyment. But when we have a future that we're working toward, and that causes us to select what activities and throw ourselves more heartily into them, that means then that we have on top of the rest of the satisfaction, the added satisfaction of knowing we're getting somewhere. We're going to accomplish something. And even now, in the present, as I look forward to the goals of my life, there is a kind of an exhilaration, a sense of meaningfulness and satisfaction that comes because now my life is going somewhere. My actions, my behaviors are organized in terms of that goal toward which I am working. And so that greater satisfaction is something that we can experience if we keep in mind the future that God is leading us towards. So the future increases satisfaction by organizing our lives. Now there's a second thing that the future has as an impact upon our behavior. And this is very important for us. That is that the future restrains sin by providing consequences. When we stop to think about the consequences of our actions, then we remember a statement such as like what Paul made in 1 Corinthians 15. He had this to say, "Evil companions corrupt good morals." In talking about the resurrection, he adds to all of that the statement that if there is no such thing as the future, if there is no resurrection, then eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. The statement that he picks up really on the basis of Isaiah reminds us that when we don't have something to look forward to, we're not nearly so concerned about the effects of our actions, especially when we take eternity into consideration, and when we take into consideration that our eternity involves more than the space, time, physical world in which we find ourselves now. It makes a great impact upon our choices as to what we're going to do. It causes us to think twice about our words and about our deeds, and it also causes us to replace the notion of immediate gratification with delayed gratification. Sometimes we have to make things a little harder for ourselves right now because in the end we want a greater result. It's kind of like weightlifting perhaps. It makes you uncomfortable in the process of doing all these exercises. Your muscles get sore and all that. But if you're concerned to be a stronger person, you will put up with that right now because of the future that you're trying to aim toward. And that means in terms of moral behavior that when we are concerned about permanent relationships, we are going to consider what we do now and not just what immediate gratification can come to us. There's a statement in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, about Moses that I like for us to think of as an example here. It says, "By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing instead to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasure of sin for a while, accounting the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward." He was willing to put up with some things right now because of what was going to happen in the future. And so some of the pleasures of sin that perhaps he could have had because of his position in Egyptian society, he set aside. And we will do that same thing. There are certain actions that might be fun or stimulating to be involved in, but when we know that those are going to ruin our relationship with our husband or spouse, our husband or wife, or ruin our relationship with our kids, or may cause us to lose our job, we will restrain ourselves from doing that. In other words, the future is having its effect upon us. Another thing about the future is that the future strengthens us by offering triumph. Prophecy in Scripture is not so much the matter of writing history ahead of time as it is to giving us the guarantee and the promise that good is going to triumph over evil. That means that now, as I try to live out my present life, I am going to be strengthened to deal with those problems that I have to face. The other thing is that the future gives us strength for the present, for meeting the present challenges. When we know that there is going to be a future coming out of all of this that is good for us, then we will put up even with persecution and pain and perhaps suffering because we are empowered by that future hope to do so. The actual future triumph of God over evil is then an encouragement to us to provide a solution to our present distresses. The future is not just some sort of an imaginary utopia. It is real. And because of that, then we are encouraged to be strong in the midst of persecution. Now, there is another dimension, a fourth one, to this power of the future upon the present, and that is that the future instills more wonder by creating new things. Isaiah, in 2 or 3 places, has something to say about all of that, but in the 43rd chapter, verses 18 and 19, he says, "Do not remember the former things, neither consider the things of old. Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it will spring forth." The book of Revelation talks also about making all things new. In Christianity, we view the future as an ever-extending line. We have what's called a linear view of history. It's not a cyclical view where the only options are the ones that have always been around, and the only things that can happen, the only things we can do are just matters of bouncing around among the old choices. There is a sense of wonder and awe that is legitimate for Christian people to have, because they have a God that is able to do abundantly more, not only than we expect, but abundantly more than has been done in the past. And so that exhilarates us, and we look forward to the new things that God is going to do in His history. In summation, we can go to the diagram that we have been using all along to summarize the concerns that we have in this study of basic Christianity. Our relationship to God and our relationship to other people is the context in which our personal development must take place. Now, this vertical and horizontal and personal dimension, we have tried to add to in this particular study by talking about the eternal. The eternal things are the things that are true. The invisible things are eternal. So we want to live then in light of the ongoing history of God. It is as if we have these 3 dimensions going right on down through this wall for the rest of life. And if we live life in terms of that, it's going to create a greater satisfaction and joy even now in the present.